The clock on James Wilson's dashboard read 11:47 p.m. as he drove through the quiet suburban streets of Arlington. His eyes were heavy after 14 hours at Langley. The CIA intelligence analyst had changed out of his suit into jeans and a dark blue sweater before leaving the office, looking forward to finally getting home, making a sandwich, and falling into bed. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror caught him by surprise. James checked his speed. He was going exactly 5 miles under the limit, something his friends always teased him about. He pulled over carefully, positioning his car properly against the curb, and rolled down his window. 2 officers approached his car, one on each side. The taller one, whose nameplate read Brentwood, shined a flashlight directly into James's face. The beam was unnecessarily bright, making James squint and raise his hand slightly to block the glare. "License and registration," Officer Brentwood demanded, his tone already sharp despite James having done nothing but comply. "Of course, officer," James replied calmly. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" "You ran through a stop sign back at Maple and Jefferson," the second officer, Kelly, said from the passenger window, his hand resting casually on his holster. James was certain he had come to a complete stop there. He had even looked both ways twice, a habit from his training. "With all due respect, sir, I'm positive I stopped completely," James said while carefully reaching for his wallet. He moved slowly, making sure both officers could see his hands at all times. Officer Brentwood's face hardened. "Are you calling me a liar?" "No, sir." "Not at all," James replied, maintaining his composure. "I'm just confused about what happened." As James handed over his license and registration, Officer Kelly's flashlight beam swept across the interior of the car. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" Brentwood asked, studying James's license with narrowed eyes. "I'm heading home, sir." "I live about 10 minutes from here on Oakwood Drive." The officers exchanged glances. "Oakwood? That's the gated community?" Kelly asked with obvious disbelief. "Yes, sir. I've lived there for about 3 years now." Brentwood handed the license to Kelly, who walked back to the patrol car to run it. Meanwhile, Brentwood continued questioning James. "Where are you coming from so late?" "Work." "It was a long day." James answered truthfully but vaguely, careful not to mention his employer. "What kind of work has you out this late?" Brentwood pressed, leaning down to peer into the car. "Government consulting," James replied, using his standard cover story. Brentwood's flashlight lingered on James's backpack in the passenger seat. The ordinary black bag contained nothing but his laptop, security badge, tucked away in an inner pocket, and a half-eaten protein bar. "I smell marijuana coming from this vehicle," Brentwood suddenly announced, though James knew there was nothing of the sort. "Sir, there's no marijuana in my car. I don't use drugs," James said firmly. Officer Kelly returned, handing Brentwood a slip of paper. They whispered something James couldn't hear. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Brentwood ordered. "May I ask why?" "I haven't done anything wrong," James questioned, his heart rate picking up despite his outward calm. "I said step out of the vehicle. We need to search it based on probable cause." Brentwood's voice rose as his hand moved to rest on his taser. James knew his rights. "Officer, with all respect, I don't consent to a search. If you smell something, you're mistaken." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Both officers stiffened and Brentwood's face flushed with anger. "Listen, buddy, you can do this the easy way or the hard way. Step out now." James weighed his options. He could continue objecting, knowing he was in the right, or comply to de-escalate and address the injustice through proper channels later. Years of training told him to choose the path with the least immediate risk. "I'm going to step out, but I want to be clear that I don't consent to any search," James said, slowly unbuckling his seatbelt. "I believe this stop has become unconstitutional." As soon as James's feet hit the pavement, Officer Brentwood grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. "You're being detained for obstruction," Brentwood growled, the cold metal of handcuffs clicking around James's wrists. "People like you always think you know the law better than we do." James remained silent as they led him to the patrol car, his mind already calculating his next moves. This wasn't the first time he'd been profiled, but it was the first time he'd been arrested for it. As the door shut beside him, James took a deep breath. He knew exactly who to call when he got his one phone call, and the officers had no idea who they had just arrested. The holding cell at the Arlington police station smelled of bleach and sweat. James sat on the hard metal bench, his back against the cold concrete wall. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the small room. His wrists were still red and sore from the tight handcuffs. 3 hours had passed since the traffic stop. 3 hours of being processed, photographed, and fingerprinted while officers Brentwood and Kelly filled out paperwork and exchanged smug looks. James had remained silent throughout, giving only necessary information when asked directly. Wilson, a heavy-set desk sergeant, called, unlocking the cell door. "You get your phone call now." James stood up, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness. The sergeant led him to a wall-mounted phone in the hallway, then stepped back just far enough to give the illusion of privacy while still monitoring the conversation. James dialed a number he rarely used but had memorized years ago. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "This is Thompson." "Sir, it's Wilson," James said quietly. "I've had an incident." There was a brief pause. "Location?" Thompson asked, his tone shifting to one of professional concern. "Arlington PD. I've been arrested following a traffic stop." James could hear the supple sound of typing in the background. "Charges? Resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. They wanted to search my vehicle without cause. I declined." More typing sounds. "Any mention of your employment?" "No, sir," James replied. "I've kept that information private." "Good," Thompson said. "Anyone injured?" "No injuries on either side," James confirmed, conscious of the sergeant listening nearby. "Standard protocol then, say nothing about your position unless absolutely critical." "I'll have someone monitoring. Keep your head down and this will resolve." "Understood," James said, relief washing over him. The CIA wouldn't abandon one of their own. "Wilson," Thompson added before hanging up, "remember your training. Observe everything." The line went dead, and James handed the phone back to the sergeant, who looked mildly curious about the cryptic conversation. "Your lawyer?" the sergeant asked. "Something like that," James replied. Back in the holding cell, a young officer James hadn't seen before brought him a thin blanket and a paper cup of water. "You're spending the night," the officer said, not unkindly. "Judge won't see you until morning." James nodded his thanks. As the officer turned to leave, James noticed him glance at a clipboard. "Wilson, James T., the young officer read from the sheet. Says here you're charged with resisting and obstruction, Brentwood's arrest." He looked up with a flicker of what seemed like sympathy. "Tough break." "Does Officer Brentwood make many arrests like this?" James asked casually. The young officer hesitated. "Not my place to say." He shifted uncomfortably. "Get some sleep if you can." Left alone, James closed his eyes but kept his mind active. He recounted every detail of the traffic stop, mentally noting inconsistencies in the officer's behavior and procedural violations. His training had taught him to memorize faces, times, and exact words spoken, all valuable information that might prove useful later. Around 2 a.m., James heard Officers Brentwood and Kelly talking as they passed by his cell. "Got the paperwork finished?" one asked. "Yeah, just filing the evidence report now," came the reply. "Evidence? From his car?" A laugh. "Found a little residue on the floorboard, enough to make our case solid." James's eyes snapped open, but he remained perfectly still. There had been absolutely nothing in his car. They were planting evidence. The night crept by slowly. James dozed off briefly around 4 a.m., only to be awakened at 6:30 for his arraignment. A different officer brought him a stale sandwich and another cup of water. "Court in an hour," the officer informed him. "Public defenders waiting to talk to you." James was led to a small consultation room where a harried-looking woman in her 30s sat surrounded by file folders. Her nameplate read Al Richardson, public defender. "Mr. Wilson," she said without looking up, "I'm Lisa Richardson, your court-appointed attorney. We don't have much time, so let's get to it." She finally raised her eyes to meet his. "First offense." "Yes," James replied. "And there shouldn't be one now. I didn't do anything wrong." Lisa sighed, having clearly heard this many times before. "The report says you refused to comply with officers during a traffic stop, then resisted arrest. They'd also found drug residue in your vehicle. That's false, James stated firmly. They're lying about the residue. And I never resisted. Lisa gave him a weary look. It's your word against two officers. Judge Harmon tends to side with law enforcement. She shuffled some papers. The DA might offer a plea bargain, probably probation, community service, maybe a fine. I'm not interested in a plea, James said. I want to fight this. That's not advisable, Lisa replied, studying him more carefully now. Is there something you're not telling me that might help your case? James thought about Thompson's instructions. Not yet. Just that I'm innocent, he said. And I have the right to a fair trial. Lisa nodded slowly, seeming to reassess her new client. All right then, Mr. Wilson, let's go see the judge. 2 weeks had passed since James's arraignment. He sat in his living room, a cup of coffee growing cold beside his laptop. The judge had set his trial date for next month and released him on his own recognizance, a small victory that Lisa Richardson, his public defender, had seemed surprised by. The evidence report from Officers Brentwood and Kelly just came in, Lisa said over the phone. James had her on speaker while he took notes. They're claiming they found traces of cocaine on your floorboard. James shook his head in disbelief. That's impossible. They've got lab results to back it up, Lisa continued, her voice tired. And there's more. They've amended their statement to say you were verbally threatening during the stop. That's simply not true, James said, keeping his voice level despite his rising anger. Look, Mr. Wilson, I believe you, but this case is getting harder, not easier. A pause. You sure you don't want to consider that plea deal? The DA's office is still offering probation. No play, James replied firmly. I didn't do anything wrong. After hanging up, James stayed out his window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The situation was worse than he'd anticipated. Not only were the officers lying, but they were coordinating their stories and falsifying evidence. His phone buzzed with a text from an unlisted number, Pack 7 received. Stay course. James deleted the message immediately. The brief communication told him everything he needed to know. Thompson was working behind the scenes. Across town at Langley, CIA Deputy Director Thompson sat in his secure office, reviewing the report his team had compiled. On his desk lay photographs of Officers Brentwood and Kelly, along with their complete service records. 6 complaints of excessive force for Brentwood in the last 3 years, noted a woman sitting across from him. Anna Chen was Thompson's most trusted analyst, and she had been personally overseeing James's case. All dismissed, Thompson observed, flipping through the file. Yes, but there's a pattern. All 6 complainants were black or Hispanic men between the ages of 25 and 40, Anna replied. And look at the bodycam issue. Thompson turned the page. Both officers reported equipment malfunction. Exactly. But the department's maintenance logs show no record of repair requests. Anna handed him another document. We've subpoenaed the traffic camera footage from the intersection where James allegedly ran the stop sign. And it shows him coming to a complete stop. The officers lied about the reason for pulling him over. Thompson nodded, unsurprised. What about the drug evidence? That's where it gets interesting, Anna said, leaning forward. The chain of custody document shows the evidence was logged at 3:17 a.m., nearly 4 hours after James's car was impounded. The department's own security footage shows Officer Kelly entering the impound lot at 2:48 a.m. that night. No official reason was recorded for his visit. Thompson's eyes narrowed. They planted it. It appears so. We've also pulled their text messages. Anna's face hardened. They coordinated their stories, sir. This was deliberate. Thompson picked up a sealed envelope. Make sure this gets to Wilson securely. It contains everything he might need, but stressed that he should only use it if absolutely necessary. We don't want to expose operations unnecessarily. Understood, Anna replied, taking the envelope. Should I include the traffic camera footage? Yes, but not the text messages. We can't reveal how we obtained those without raising questions. Thompson stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Wilson is one of our best. I won't let 2 corrupt cops ruin his career. Meanwhile, back at the Arlington Police Department, Officers Brentwood and Kelly sat in the break room, coffee cups in hand. Trial's next month, Brentwood said casually. The guy's still refusing to play. Kelly shrugged. Doesn't matter. His word against ours, and we've got the evidence. Judge Hartman hasn't ruled against a cop in 6 years. You think he'll get jail time? Probably not for a first offense, but he'll get a record. Kelly smirked. Should have just let us search the car. Lieutenant Rivera walked in, catching the tail end of their conversation. He paused by the coffee machine, giving the two officers a long look. Something on your mind, Lieutenant? Brentwood asked. Just wondering why you two are so interested in this Wilson case, Rivera replied carefully. Seems like a lot of paperwork for a simple traffic stop. Guy was disrespectful, Kelly said quickly. We don't tolerate that. Rivera nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. After pouring his coffee, he left without another word. What's his problem? Brentwood muttered. Forget him, Kelly replied. Let's go over our testimony again. We need to make sure our stories line up perfectly for court. What they didn't know was that Lieutenant Rivera had paused outside the door listening. After a moment, he walked to his office and closed the door. He sat at his desk for a long time, thinking about what he'd just heard and what, if anything, he should do about it. The evening before the trial, James paced the length of his kitchen, phone pressed to his ear. The hardwood floor creaked beneath his feet as his public defender delivered the latest update. The DA called me personally today, Lisa said, her voice betraying a mix of frustration and concern. They're offering an even better deal now. 6 months probation, a small fine, and the whole thing gets expunged after a year. James stopped pacing. They're getting nervous. Maybe, Lisa admitted. But this is still a good deal, Mr. Wilson. Better than most of my clients ever see. Why would they offer that if they're so confident in their case? Lisa sighed. Look, I've been doing this for 8 years. Sometimes the system works in weird ways. Maybe they're overloaded with cases. Maybe they just don't think you're worth the court time. She paused. This isn't about principle, it's about your future. A drug charge, even a minor one, will follow you forever. It'll affect job opportunities, housing applications. I appreciate your concern, James replied, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 8 p.m., but I'm not taking the deal. Mr. Wilson, Lisa's voice grew serious. I need to be completely honest with you. The odds are not in our favor. It's your word against 2 officers with clean records that have physical evidence and documented testimony. She lowered her voice. I've seen Judge Hartman's rulings for years. He believes cops. Almost always. James walked to his window, looking out at the darkening neighborhood. I understand the risks. Do you? Because I'm not sure you do. Lisa wasn't bothering to hide her frustration anymore. The maximum sentence could be up to a year in county jail. Is that really worth it to make a point? It's not about making a point, James said quietly. It's about the truth. After hanging up, James checked his security system, a habit from years of intelligence work, and drew the blinds. The doorbell rang exactly at 8:30 p.m., right on schedule. James checked the camera feed before opening the door. Anna Chen stood on his porch, dressed in casual clothes that wouldn't draw attention in this upscale neighborhood. She carried what looked like a food delivery bag. Evening, she said with a nod as James let her in. Got your dinner. Once inside with the door locked, Anna set the bag on the kitchen counter and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. Thompson sends his regards, she said, her tone shifting to business. Everything you might need is in here, but remember, only as a last resort. We'd prefer to keep your connection to us quiet if possible. James took the envelope. What's the latest? We have the traffic cam footage showing you stopped completely at the sign. We have maintenance logs proving their bodycams should have been functional, and we have the impound lot security footage showing Officer Kelly entering your car hours after it was logged in. Anna's expression was grim. They're dirty, James. Not enough to prove they planted evidence, James observed. No, but enough to create reasonable doubt. Anna checked her watch. There's something else. Lieutenant Rivera from their precinct has been asking questions, pulled their past arrest records, focusing on similar cases. Is he a problem? We don't think so. Background check shows he's clean. 20 years on the force, multiple commendations for community policing. He might actually be one of the good ones. Anna moved toward the door. One last thing. If you did need to reveal your position, Thompson has cleared you to show level 3 credentials only. Nothing higher. James nodded. Understood. Good luck tomorrow, Anna said. I'll be in the gallery back row. Just another concerned citizen. After she left, James opened the envelope. Inside were copies of documents, photos, and a small flash drive. He spread them across his dining room table, studying each item carefully. The evidence was compelling but not overwhelming. If he revealed his CIA connection, it would change everything, but it would also potentially compromise years of work. As midnight approached, James packed everything back into the envelope and tucked it into his briefcase. He laid out his suit for tomorrow, not his best one, but a modest, respectable outfit that wouldn't stand out. The kind a government office worker might wear, not an intelligence officer. Sleep didn't come easily. James lay awake, planning for every possible scenario in the courtroom. He had spent years training for high-pressure situations, but tomorrow would test him in ways field work never had. Because tomorrow, he wouldn't be fighting foreign adversaries or tracking security threats. He'd be fighting a system that was supposed to protect him, not persecute him. His phone buzzed with a text message at 1:17 a.m. All set for tomorrow. Trust your training. James deleted the message and finally closed his eyes. Tomorrow would decide everything. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as James sat beside Lisa at the defense table. Wooden benches creaked with movement as people settled in for the morning session. James kept his expression neutral, but he couldn't help noticing how the room seemed divided. Police officers and courthouse regulars on one side, a sprinkling of curious onlookers on the other. He spotted Anna in the back row, dressed in a plain blouse and slacks, looking like any other courtroom observer. District Attorney Frank Powell arranged papers at the prosecution table. He was a heavy-set man with graying hair and the confident demeanor of someone who won cases far more often than he lost them. Officers Brentwood and Kelly sat directly behind him, both in crisp uniforms with polished badges. They looked calm, even bored, as if this were just another routine day. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Harmon entered the courtroom. Judge Harmon was tall and thin with a permanent frown etched into his face. He settled into his seat and peered at the courtroom over reading glasses. "Commonwealth versus James Wilson," he announced. "Charges of resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, and possession of a controlled substance. Are both sides ready to proceed?" "Ready for the prosecution, Your Honor," Powell stated, standing. "Ready for the defense," Lisa replied, sounding less confident. The trial began with opening statements. Powell approached the jury box with practiced ease. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice projecting easily across the room. "This case is straightforward. On the night of April 15th, Officers Brentwood and Kelly were simply doing their job, protecting our community. They observed the defendant, Mr. Wilson, running a stop sign and initiated a routine traffic stop." Powell paced slowly before the jury. But what should have been a simple interaction turned complicated when Mr. Wilson became confrontational and uncooperative. When the officers detected the smell of illegal substances and attempted to investigate, Mr. Wilson actively obstructed their duties and resisted lawful commands. James clenched his jaw but kept his face impassive. Every word was a lie. Powell continued, "The officers will testify to Mr. Wilson's belligerent behavior that night, and the evidence will show that their suspicions were justified. Laboratory tests confirmed the presence of cocaine residue in the defendant's vehicle." He paused for effect. "These officers put their lives on the line every day to keep our streets safe. Mr. Wilson chose to obstruct justice rather than comply with lawful orders. The prosecution will prove beyond reasonable doubt that he is guilty of all charges." When Lisa stood for her opening statement, her voice wavered slightly. "The defense will show that Mr. Wilson is a law-abiding citizen who was wrongfully targeted and arrested that night," she began. "He came to a complete stop at the intersection, was cooperative during the stop, and did not consent to a search because he knew there were no illegal substances in his vehicle." James watched the jurors' faces. Most looked skeptical, one even rolled his eyes. He knew what they were thinking. They'd heard this defense before. Officer Brentwood was the first witness called. He took the stand looking confident, even smug. "Officer Brentwood," Powell began after the oath was administered, "please tell the court what happened on the night of April 15th. My partner, Officer Kelly, and I were on patrol in the Arlington Heights neighborhood when we observed a black sedan fail to stop at the intersection of Maple and Jefferson," Brentwood stated, his voice steady and professional. "We activated our lights and pulled the vehicle over. The driver, identified as the defendant, immediately appeared agitated." Liza scribbled notes while James maintained his composure even as his pulse quickened. "When I approached the vehicle and requested license and registration, the defendant began questioning why he'd been stopped in an aggressive manner," Brentwood continued. "His behavior raised suspicions, and when my partner approached the passenger side, he detected the odor of marijuana coming from the vehicle." Powell nodded encouragingly. "What happened next?" "I asked Mr. Wilson to step out of the vehicle so we could conduct a search based on probable cause. He refused multiple direct orders and became verbally threatening," Brentwood said, looking directly at the jury. "For our safety and his, we removed him from the vehicle and placed him under arrest for obstruction." "And did you search the vehicle following the arrest?" "Yes, sir. We conducted a standard inventory search and discovered what appeared to be cocaine residue on the floorboard. The substance was collected and sent to the lab for testing." Powell held up a document, and the lab confirmed this was cocaine, correct? "That's correct," Brentwood replied confidently. James glanced across the courtroom and caught Anna's eye. She gave him a nearly imperceptible nod. In his briefcase beside his chair, he felt the weight of the envelope containing the truth, evidence he might soon have no choice but to reveal. "No further questions for this witness," Powell announced with satisfaction. Judge Harmon turned to Liza. "Your witness, counselor." Liza stood, clutching her legal pad. "Officer Brentwood, let's talk about your bodycam that night." By mid-afternoon, the prosecution had presented its entire case. Officer Kelly had backed up his partner's testimony almost word for word. The lab technician had confirmed the presence of cocaine residue. James had watched the jury's faces throughout. They were buying every bit of it. Now finally, it was his turn. "The defense calls James Wilson to the stand," Liza announced, her voice stronger than it had been all day. James stood, straightened his tie, and walked to the witness stand. He felt every eye in the courtroom following him. After being sworn in, he sat down, keeping his posture straight but relaxed. "Mr. Wilson," Liza began, "could you tell the court what happened on the night of April 15th from your perspective?" "Yes," James replied, his voice clear and steady. "I was driving home from work, traveling south on Maple Street. I came to a complete stop at the intersection with Jefferson, looked both ways, and proceeded. About half a block later, I noticed police lights behind me and pulled over immediately." "And how did you interact with the officers?" "I was respectful and calm," James said. "When Officer Brentwood claimed I had run the stop sign, I disagreed politely but didn't argue further. I provided my license and registration when asked." "At any point, did you become aggressive or threatening toward the officers?" "No, I did not. I remained calm throughout the encounter." Liza nodded. "The officers testified that they smelled marijuana coming from your vehicle. Do you use marijuana, Mr. Wilson?" "No. I don't use any illegal substances." "Yet they claim they found cocaine residue in your car. How do you explain that?" James looked directly at the jury. "There were no drugs in my car." "I don't use drugs. I've never used drugs." Liza walked closer to the stand. "Mr. Wilson, what do you do for a living?" District Attorney Powell stood up quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance." "Your Honor," Liza countered, "the prosecution has portrayed my client as a drug user who disrespects authority. His occupation speaks directly to his character and credibility." Judge Harmon considered for a moment. "I'll allow it. The witness may answer." James took a deep breath. The moment of truth had arrived. "I work for the Central Intelligence Agency," he stated calmly. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Powell looked startled. Officers Brentwood and Kelly exchanged glances. "And what is your role at the CIA, Mr. Wilson?" Liza asked. "I'm a senior intelligence analyst with top-secret security clearance." Powell was on his feet again. "Your Honor, the witness is making claims that cannot be verified. Anyone could claim to work for the CIA." "Your Honor," Liza replied, "my client has documentation to verify his employment." Judge Harmon frowned. "Approach the bench, both of you." As the attorneys moved forward, James reached inside his jacket pocket and removed a slim leather wallet. Inside was his CIA credentials card with his photo, name, and clearance level clearly visible. He handed it to the court officer who brought it to the judge. Judge Harmon examined the ID carefully, then looked at James with new interest. "Mr. Wilson, are you able to provide additional verification of your employment?" "Yes, Your Honor." James gestured toward his briefcase at the defense table. "With the court's permission, I have documentation that will not only verify my employment, but also directly contradicts the testimony given by Officers Brentwood and Kelly." The courtroom fell completely silent. Powell looked increasingly uncomfortable. Officer Brentwood whispered something urgently to Kelly. "Bailiff, please bring the defendant's briefcase," Judge Harmon ordered. When the briefcase arrived, James removed the sealed envelope Anna had delivered. He handed over several documents to the judge. "Your Honor, this first document is a letter from CIA Deputy Director Thompson confirming my employment and security clearance status." James then pulled out a USB drive. "This contains traffic camera footage from the intersection of Maple and Jefferson showing that I came to a complete stop that night. It also contains security footage from the police impound lot showing Officer Kelly entering my vehicle at 2:48 a.m., hours after it was impounded and shortly before the alleged drug evidence was logged into evidence." Officer Brentwood's face had gone pale. Kelly stared at the floor. "Your Honor," James continued, "I would never jeopardize my security clearance by using illegal substances. I undergo random drug testing as part of my employment. My most recent test was 3 days before this incident, which I passed, as verified in that documentation." Judge Harmon reviewed the materials, his expression growing darker by the second. "Mr. Powell," the judge said finally, "I believe we need to have a serious discussion about the evidence in this case." He turned to the jury. "We're going to take a 30-minute recess. Bailiff, please escort Officers Brentwood and Kelly to my chambers. They are not to leave the courthouse." As the judge stood, the courtroom erupted with whispers. Anna caught James's eye from the back row and gave him a small nod of approval. Lissa looked at James with newfound respect and many questions. The truth was finally coming to light, and the officers who had lied were about to face the consequences of picking the wrong man to frame. 3 weeks had passed since that day in court. James sat on a park bench, watching kids play soccer on the field nearby. The afternoon sun felt warm on his face, a simple pleasure he had learned to appreciate even more after everything that happened. "Mind if I join you?" James looked up to see Lieutenant Rivera standing there, now in plain clothes rather than his uniform. "Please," James said, gesturing to the empty space beside him. Rivera sat down with a sigh. "Thought I might find you here. You mentioned you liked this park during your statement." After Judge Harmon had reviewed the evidence, things had moved quickly. The case against James was dismissed with prejudice. Internal Affairs had immediately opened an investigation into Officers Brentwood and Kelly. "How's the investigation going?" James asked, keeping his eyes on the soccer game. "Both officers are suspended without pay," Rivera replied. "The DA's office is considering criminal charges for evidence tampering and perjury." He shook his head. "We found a pattern, Mr. Wilson. 6 other cases with similar circumstances, all black men, all questionable traffic stops that led to drug charges." James nodded. He wasn't surprised. "I wanted to apologize," Rivera continued, "not just for what happened to you, but because I suspected something wasn't right with those 2 for months. I should have acted sooner." "Why didn't you?" Rivera thought for a moment. "It's complicated. You need evidence to make accusations against fellow officers, and without hard proof." He trailed off. "The blue wall of silence," James observed. "Something like that," Rivera admitted. "But what happened to you, that was the tipping point. We can't have officers like that wearing the badge." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the soccer game reach its noisy conclusion. "The chief wants to meet with you," Rivera finally said. "The department is implementing new training programs. Bodycams that can't be so easily malfunctioning. Better oversight. He thinks your perspective would be valuable." James considered this. "I might take him up on that." As Rivera stood to leave, he hesitated. "One more thing. Your CIA credentials, that must have been quite the shock for Brentwood and Kelly." James smiled slightly. Sometimes people make assumptions based on what they see. A black man driving through a certain neighborhood at night. They thought they knew exactly who I was. Then mistake, Rivera said, extending his hand. James shook it, one they won't be making again. Later that evening, James sat in a small conference room at the community center. Around the table were a dozen men and women of various ages and backgrounds. Some were lawyers, some were community activists, and others were simply concerned citizens. First, James began, I want to thank everyone for coming. What happened to me had a specific outcome because of my position. But we all know that isn't the reality for most people who experience police misconduct. A young woman named Kira nodded. Most people don't have CIA clearance to flash in court. Exactly, James agreed. Which is why this Community Oversight Committee is so important. The department has agreed to monthly meetings where citizens can review bodycam footage from arrests and traffic stops. An older man named Dale leaned forward. Will the police actually listen to us? The chief has committed to it in writing, James replied, sliding a document across the table. With Lieutenant Rivera as our department liaison. But more importantly, the mayor is on board. The city council has approved funding for additional training and community policing initiatives. So your case actually changed something, Kira said, sounding surprised. James shook his head. My case was just the catalyst. The real change happens because of people like everyone in this room, willing to put in the work. As the meeting progressed, James felt a sense of purpose he hadn't expected. His CIA work had always been about protecting the country from external threats. But this was about protecting people from threats within the system itself. When he got home that night, his phone buzzed with a text from Thompson, proud of what you're doing. Some battles are worth fighting in the open. James smiled. He had spent years in the shadows, working in secret to protect American interests abroad. But sometimes the most important work happened in the light, where everyone could see it. The next morning, James drove through the same intersection where he'd been pulled over months ago. He came to a complete stop, just as he always did. But this time, he noticed something new, a traffic camera being installed. A small change, but a meaningful one. As he drove on, he thought about all the people who'd faced what he had, but without his resources and connections to fight back. That was changing now, one step at a time. And James was proud to be part of making that change happen.